Okay, so I've always been a moral anti-realist. I didn't believe objective moral facts existed. I evolved from a moral subjectivist, believing moral truths were dependent on an individual's personal beliefs, to a moral nihilist, believing there were no moral truths at all. Now, I've not believed in any form of objective morality since the start of my pursuit in philosophy, but all my beliefs were put into question by Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. While reading it, a question came into my head, and this point doesn't solve everything, but it does send me back into questioning. This is the premise. If an event causes no gain to any conscious being, in what universe can it ever be perceived as good, and vice versa? Quite a simple point, and admittedly an inherently flawed one, but it did get me thinking. The reason why it's flawed, you see, is because it targets moral subjectivism and moral nihilism. But from the perspective of a moral subjectivist, they can simply say, just because no one perceives it as bad doesn't mean it can't be seen as bad. And a moral nihilist says, no, it isn't seen as good. It's simply completely neutral. So while my original thought was flawed, it did get me thinking, and this is what my thoughts came to. The definitions of good are all linked to pleasure, and the definitions of bad are linked to pain. If something causes pleasure, it's generally labelled good, and that what causes pain, bad. In that case, while the words good and bad are subjective, like all words, their connotations are what brings pleasure and what brings pain, which can be measured scientifically. However, moral obligation is a different story. Saying you ought to do this, full stop, is semantically flawed. The definition of should and ought use completely circular reasoning. David Hume concluded that you can't derive an ought from an is, so there's no logical way to get to moral obligation. You could maybe say you ought to do this if you prioritise this, but simply saying you ought to do this isn't logically valid. Therefore, I believe that while good and bad can be linked to measurable pleasure and pain, obligations, what we should do, aren't grounded in any universal fact. This is why it's important to take in information from those you disagree with, and to be open to changing your mind, because the goal should be the truth, not what you want to be true. And of course, I'm using the word should here loosely, after all we've talked about. Thank you for staying with me in the sanctum for a while. If you want to discuss or disagree with anything I've said, please comment, because discourse and discussion are necessary for a healthy, intelligent society. Subscribe to see more content like this, and I'll see you later.